Okay, folks, so this week we'll be talking about the rise of communism, and we'll be looking at a few different governments in the 20th century that use communism, quote unquote, um, and try to establish a communist government. Now, when we talked about communism a few weeks ago, we know that communism is and has never been reached in its full in government, and we're going to talk about why that happens and what different countries it happened to in the past 100 or so years. So, to start off, I just want to review what communism is. So, communism is a political theory in which everybody gets what they need according to their abilities or their needs. Generally, there's no private property, and the idea is that those workers that are very, very poor or aren't living great lives overthrow the richer class. You remember the bourgeois class that um, leads the factories and has a little bit more money. And essentially, if you remember what we did with our hands, the proletariat are at the bottom and the bourgeois are at the top. And with this overthrowing, the bourgeois come down and the money from the bourgeois goes to the proletariat, and they're both at this equal spot in the middle. Now, we talked about how the proletariats are going to love this and how the bourgeois class aren't going to like this so much. And so, oftentimes, and in the cases that we'll be looking at today, um, the countries that try communism are more workers. They have a lot of workers and are an industrial kind of little industrial countries. Okay, so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But what I want to talk about prior to that is how these communist countries or the attempts at the communist countries turn into not communism and end up being this dictatorship. And that's called totalitarianism. So, totalitarianism is a mouthful, but it's a system of government that has full control over the people. And the people are obedient to the government. And if they aren't obedient, then there are consequences, and the consequences are very severe. There is often a dictator, and that dictator is the leader and sometimes even the religion of the country. So Stalin is very similar to that. North Korea is similar to that. Some dictatorships that you would know about that are totalitarianisms but are not communist are Mussolini, Hitler, Franco in Spain. Okay, but the communist ones we'll be talking about today are Russia, China, and North Korea. And all three of those really hit their prime after the World Wars. However, they start to be established right after or during World War One. And so that's why we're talking about it today. So our first one is the Russian Revolution of 1917. And you folks will be looking at quite a few pieces of information about this. So you have a Newsella article along with a couple of videos to watch, okay? So this is the first communist revolution in the 1900s, and it's the first successful communist revolution that you see. And the Russians actually have to pull out of World War One due to the revolution. Vladimir Lenin, is sent in from the Germans and is sent in to be a political leader in Russia, and so he leads the Bolshevik Party, which is the communist party in Russia, and they lead and take over the communist. With the communist revolution, Lenin then takes power, and after Lenin dies in the 1920s, Joseph Stalin, who you might recognize, becomes the leader of communist Russia. Okay, that in this time period it's known as the USSR, so the United Soviet Socialist Republic. And just note that the USSR has the word socialist in it, and so they are attempting to reach communism, but like we talked about a few weeks ago, socialism is that precursor to communism. So Russia really never leaves that socialist idea, especially because Joseph Stalin really takes the leadership as a dictatorship. Okay. Our next one is China. So you guys are going to have a choice to either look at China or North Korea this week, and you can choose whichever one you want. I'm going to give you a quick background on both, and then you are welcome to look at whichever one that you're most interested in. So China's communism began in the 1930s when China was doing really, really poorly economically. So China's dynasties had fallen. They had tried a democratic government. It wasn't really working. And Japan had started to imperialize China. And so the workers and the rural peasants of China were really found communism and Mao's leadership to be very convincing, and they liked that. And so, by 1949, Mao Zedong became the ruler of China, the communist ruler of China. One of the biggest things that Mao has in China is his Little Red Book. So everybody, and this is part of his totalitarianism, everybody in the country always had to have their Little Red Book on them. And the Little Red Book had sayings from Mao about communism and about the leadership that communism provides. And they always had to have that on them. And if they didn't, there would be severe consequences. So China, when Mao died in the 1970s, China did not have as much of a communist idea or socialist idea, but it has persisted in that country. North Korea, we know today as a communist country. Again, it is a quote unquote communist country. It really doesn't have all the qualities of pure communism. But the Korean War in the 1950s is what split Korea into North and South Korea. Okay, so North Korea is the communist portion and South Korea was the democratic portion. And if anybody knows anything about United States history, you know that the Cold War happened in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And that the United States was having this disagreement with Russia about political ideologies. So what you saw in the Cold War was not direct conflict, but kind of indirect conflict. So the North Korean and South Korean War, it was really a civil war in North Korea and South Korea, but the Russians supported North Korea with communism and the idea that they wanted to have a communist government. And the United States supported the South Korean government um, and the democratic ideas of the South Korean government. And so this war is actually not over. There was an armistice in the 1950s. However, there's been no treaty. And so that it's called the demilitarized zone. That zone is still active. It's an active war zone. There hasn't been a large amount of activity in the war zone in the past few decades, but it is still something that is part of our world today. So the first communist leader was Kim Il-sung, and he died in 1994. And Kim Jong-il took over, and in your lifetime, actually, just about a decade ago, Kim Jong-un took over for his father, and so he is now the current leader of China. I'm sorry, of North Korea. So he's the current leader of North Korea, still a communist government. Really, nobody's allowed in North Korea or out of North Korea, which is part of that totalitarianism. Okay. So, folks, you have three different examples of communism in the 20th century here, starting after World War One. Okay. You want to remember that these countries um, they have large working peasant populations, okay, which is why communism sounds good to them. However, due to this totalitarianistic idea in the 19th century or 1900s, the leaders become fairly totalitarianistic. Okay, they become very controlling, and communism really never steps in fully. But what you have are these totalitarian socialist governments. Okay, so you guys are going to take a pretty good look at the Russian Revolution. And then after you take a look at the Russian Revolution this week, you guys are going to have the option to look at either China or North Korea. I have videos of both, and you'll answer a question about China or North Korea. You're more than welcome to do both, but just know you have the option to do one or the other.